Hello, today I would like to talk about the Korean education system. The reason why I chose this topic is because I was interested in it because I'm an education major. The grade levels are split from 1st to 6th grade, 7th to 9th grade, and 10th to 12th grade. The school year typically runs starting from March to July and then September to February. A typical high school schedule begins around 8 a.m. and classes would run into 4 or 4:30 p.m. However, for those attending private tutoring, it can last up to 10 p.m. or even past midnight. When Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule in 1945, its education system had a weak foundation. Over the past few decades, South Korea had achieved both economic development and political democracy, to which education had played an important role in. The number of higher education institutions rose quickly from 19 in 1945 to 55 in 1950. Interestingly, during Japanese colonial rule, Korea had Kejo Imperial University, which later transformed to Seoul National University through a process of merging with several public junior colleges after World War II. The development of the education system can be divided into 4 stages. First, during the 1950s, Korea achieved universal elementary education despite the Korean War and its devastating impact. During the 60s and 70s, Korea observed a dramatic expansion of secondary education and implemented the equalization policy in order to reduce competition for entrance to prestigious middle and high schools. In the 80s and 90s, Korea expanded its higher education system and made efforts to improve quality in education. During the 2000s, Korea had made efforts to promote autonomy and innovation in education while addressing new challenges facing Korean education. The Korean approach to educational expanse can be categorized as a sequential bottom-up approach. This approach began in the 50s, which enabled the country to achieve universal elementary education in the first stage of its expansion. Korea then expanded access to secondary education during the 60s and 70s by implementing an equalization policy to reduce competition and inequalities in access. During the 80s and 90s, through the July 30th Education Reform Policy of 1980, it increased admission quotas for higher education. During all of this, Korea experienced rapid economic growth thanks to a series of 5-year economic development plans. In 1998, Korea faced a financial crisis, to which the government then reduced the teacher retirement age from 65 to 62. South Korea government made special efforts to reduce class sizes to increase the number of teachers and to also improve the pay for teachers. As a result, class sizes fell from 65 to 30 by 1995. By 2005, in elementary schools, the average class size was about 25. Average salary levels for teachers with 15 years of experience rose above the average for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. Korea Education and Research Information Services provided information network services that linked major sources of academic information for research purposes. The Korea Educational Broadcasting System was established in the 80s to broadcast educational programs that linked directly to classrooms in elementary and middle schools. Between 1980 and 1995, as private tutoring was seen as a significant social problem, EBS began to provide an alternative, which was low-cost supplementary TV-based tutoring programs. Some examples of presidential education policies were Kim Dae-jun's government maintaining an equity-oriented secondary education system to reduce student needs for tutoring and introduce competition amongst universities for government funds to support research and education. Roh Moo-hyun's government expanded the welfare system for needy students and introduced after-school programs and e-learning systems to provide alternatives to tutoring for low-income families. As Lee Myung-bak's government, they implemented various deregulation measures in the name of excellence and diversity. As stated before, elementary education became mandatory in 1950 and increased in 1960, which then caused intense competition for middle school. This then led to the no examination middle school lottery system in 1969, which then transferred all competitive intensities to high school entrance policies. An increase in participation rate and expenditures for private tutoring then started to happen. Student participation in private tutoring had increased over the years, resulting in about 70% of all students participating in private tutoring in 2003. The expenditure in 2003 for private tutoring amounted to about $12 billion, which was about 56% of the national budget on education. It is also reported that Korean households spend about 10% of their income on private tutoring. In 1974, the Korean government promoted high school standardization. However, the standardization policy does not allow students to intellectually grow, which is a fear among Korean parents. This creates a downward standardization by impeding the students' learning of mathematical skills and other skills such as science. If public education developed a downward standard, then the demand of private education would naturally increase. This undermines public education and intensifies the reliance on expensive private education by family households. It is also known that South Korea's private education expenditures are ranked number 1 throughout the world. In order to tag on the issue of private education, independent private schools must be provided when they are in demand, or an improvement to public education efficiency needs to happen. Priority of liberal education and diverse education must be given to provincial areas to promote national balance, and South Koreans have the world record for educational fever, which a competitive advantage given to provincial education should achieve balance more efficiently than any other policy. South Korea's society is currently transitioning into a multicultural society. As Korean culture becomes more global and popular, there are more foreigners wanting to visit or even live in Korea. Some benefits of international students coming to Korea include financial gains through tuition fees and other expenditures, and cultivating intercultural sensitivity and global understanding. However, despite all the benefits for internationalization of higher education, it is challenging for the educational environment in Korean institutions to be inclusive and multicultural enough to accommodate for the growing number of international students. International students are likely to encounter social restrictions and discrimination while they study in South Korea. They often report a difficulty in making friends due to language barriers, cultural differences, and other such things. According to Korean student interviewees, observed that Korean students on campus acted kindly to those from Western European countries, which are economically and politically powerful, in the international society, but tended to show prejudice against those from Asian countries, especially those that were from undeveloped countries. However, international student country of origin and spoken language did not entirely determine the relationship dynamics between Korean students. It is also due to the fact that some international students had different levels of commitment and attitudes towards Korea, contributing to their hostility between each other. As Korea becomes more global, the role of English is regarded as an important job qualification. The level of English education can represent a student's educational and family background in Korean society as cultural capital. English fluency can also signify whether the family can afford a student private education or study abroad. Where one lives can also be a significant influence on educational benefits, such as Seoul versus the countryside. However, based on racism, English fluency appears to empower both international and Korean students, but discriminates against others as perceived by Korean students. As a conclusion, South Korea's society is being rapidly transformed into a multicultural society, yet there is still a strong nationalist ethos amongst Koreans, which creates hostility and ethnic discrimination. If this does not get fixed, there can be a creation of an educational gap. And here are my references.